Okay, we are live. Time for another RegTech Live. How's it going, everyone, on a Thursday afternoon? Glad you could join us today. I'm Chris Russell from RegTech Media, of course, and this is RegTechLive.com, where we talk about the latest and greatest recruiting technologies and tactics around that. So today we're going to be talking about how HR professionals should be thinking about buying HR software and technology. We'll talk about kind of managing those internal stakeholders, the budget, vetting those vendors, and kind of making the steps towards implementing your next piece of technology overall. Joining me today will be Phil Strazula. He's next to me here, and he'll introduce himself in a moment. Before we get started, just a few show notes to share. My next two webinars will be next month in June, June 6th and 13th, with a couple of vendors. First will be Alio. We'll get an update from them, the chatbot company. And then we'll have on Employ Us on the 13th, which is I believe it's a employee referral software overall. So those will be the next two ones. I'll put the links up soon. Just haven't had time to create those show pages yet for you. What else is going on? So next week on the RegTech podcast, I'll be publishing some new audio. I just got back from Tech Day in New York last week, and I have 300 startups there at the Javits Center in New York City, and I found about 9 or 10 recruiting-related ones. So I did some show floor interviews at that event, and I'll have that coming to you next Monday on the podcast. And you can go to regtechmedia.com/podcast to find those pieces of audio. Also, I'll be at Unleashed next week in Las Vegas. So if you are attending that, look forward to seeing you there. And I'll bring back audio from that as well. I got a bunch of things in the pipeline there with vendors and practitioners. And hopefully I have a number of podcast interviews from that trip as well coming at you in the coming weeks. So, all right, so let's get started. We'll bring on Phil here. Phil Strazula is with Select Software. Phil, introduce yourself to the audience. Tell them who you are, what you've been doing, and that kind of good stuff.
Yeah, sure. Hey, everybody, and thanks a lot for having me, Chris. So my name's Phil, based up here in Boston, Massachusetts. Started my career off working in the venture capital space, doing early stage investing in software and internet companies, some in the HR tech space, but mostly not. Went to business school up here at Harvard Business School, got my MBA, taught myself how to program, started an HR tech company called NextWave Hire, which is recruitment marketing for SMBs. So companies that are less than 1,000 employees, they want to have a better career website, microsites for their D&I initiatives, for sharing what's it like to be in the New York office versus San Francisco, whatever. Do that, plus talent communities, plus social media recruiting, etc. You can check out nextwavehire.com if you want to learn more about that. And then probably like 4 or 5 months ago, started a new venture called Select Software, where the basic idea is that it's really hard to buy the right software. There's hundreds of solutions out there. You want to buy a new ATS, there's literally, 300-400 ATSs out there. How do you narrow them down to like sort of the tier 1 vendors? How do you think about what questions to ask them on demos? Chris just posted that thing in the chat there, the 300 questions to ask ATS vendors. How do you think about pricing, negotiation, internal stakeholder management, all that stuff? So we do that into free online guides, and it's free because we get paid by the vendors to do various types of sponsorships and stuff like that. So yeah, if you want to check it out, selectsoftwarereviews.com.
Nice, awesome. Did you cross paths with Zuckerberg while at Harvard?
No, I
were younger.
Yeah, I don't think I was even in college by the time he was there, and then. I just went there for business school. I went to NYU undergrad.
Gotcha. Awesome. All right. So best practices for buying HR tech. So what are kind of the biggest mistakes you think TA organizations make, Phil? What are some of the pitfalls here to kind of avoid?
Yeah, I think, look, like as I sort of outlined a minute ago, I think it's really hard. And that's why I started business about this stuff. But I do think there are a couple of pitfalls people make over and over, and I guess stumble into, not really make. I think one of the first ones, and maybe we'll talk more about this in a second, is around like getting internal stakeholder buy-in. So I think a lot of people just sort of like go out in the wilderness and they're like, I'm gonna, go buy XYZ type of software, employee referral software, right? Because like we need to juice employee referrals, and they don't realize that like, oh, okay, I actually need the buy-in of like these various stakeholders. Maybe there's security, maybe there's the CFO for budget, maybe that's the hiring managers to get people to actually roll this sort of solution out, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can spend a lot of time just sort of like doing demos, doing research. And then at the end of the day, it's like, oh, wait, 2 months later, you realize this isn't possible for some sort of reason that I didn't necessarily appreciate at the beginning of this journey, because I didn't try to figure out like how to get consensus for this and maybe what are the kind of necessary hurdles we need to get across as an organization in order to buy and implement one of these tools. I think sort of like putting together the business case sometimes gets glossed over, usually pretty important, especially around budgeting and getting internal buy-in. But that's something that pretty often I see people skip over because to them, maybe it's intuitive, maybe it's obvious, and they don't need to quantify it in terms of like a spreadsheet. But your person that has the budget, it's probably not obvious to them because they're not living your day-to-day. And so I think it's really important to quantify stuff. And then also to go back, 6 months later and look at what you quantified and see if it actually played out, if your model was wildly correct or incorrect and for what reasons, and therefore how can you get better and be smarter. I think some of the other things are just like, one, most people negotiate on price, but not everybody. I think for the most part, if a vendor doesn't list their pricing on their website, it's open to negotiation. And then the last part is just around like process. I think that a lot of companies don't have like a rigorous process to be followed when discovering and vetting vendors. And if you don't, then you can get lost in the noise, right? Like we just talked about all these different ATS vendors, HRIS, payroll, like every single category has tons and tons of vendors. It's so easy to create software. You can have 2 people in a garage, like create an ATS in a couple months. That's like good enough probably for you to buy. But should you be looking at that or one of the other ones? And so you really need to, I think, create a process around how do you figure out the vendor ecosystem and then narrow it down to the people you actually want to spend time with.
Yeah. One of my tips on that would be to, leverage the crowd, right? So simple thing, easy to do, go onto Facebook. There are dozens of recruiting groups that you can join to get feedback. I see one of the top kind of things I see in these groups, I belong to a bunch of them. There's talent product plays, everyone want to call it HR techies, recruiters online. One of the common things I see people asking is, hey, I'm about to implement this vendor, or I'm thinking about buying this piece of software. Who's used it here, right?
Yeah.
Getting more honest feedback from past customers or current customers in kind of an unfiltered way, not coming from the vendor overall. So that's definitely one of my tips. What other things can they do, Phil, to kind of to vet some of these vendors like that? Because the vendor is going to give you, when you ask for referrals, they're going to give you their kind of favorite clients overall. But what other tips might you have around that?
Yeah, I think asking people in those groups is great. Just understanding like who the people are providing the advice, what their biases are, how they're similar or different from your organization, and like how, I guess, trustworthy they are. And trustworthy can be like an ethical thing. It can also be a like intellect thing. And should you kind of believe what they say, or is it just sort of like BS? It's like their initial reaction or whatever. I've had a lot of times where like somebody, gives me advice and then I like ask one question and they're like, well, I haven't actually used the tool, but like, this is what I heard at some conference,
Right.
It's like, all right, that's not super helpful. For me, like just having, a group of like 4 or 5 people in your network who kind of like are the same, demographic or like customer profile as you, like, oh, we're both, leading TA at 100-person venture-backed companies and therefore have really similar issues when it comes to everything from, culture to retention to talent acquisition. Like that's like a really good thing. There are obviously like employee review websites out there, or I'm sorry, not employee review, vendor review, like Capterra, G2 Crowd. I think those can be good. I think, the average score on one of those things is like 4.5, 5 stars. I think it's like 10% of reviews across all vendors are negative. And so there's, all vendors, meaning like a really good piece of software is 10% negative, really bad piece of software is 10% negative. And therefore, it makes me like wonder a little bit about the signal there, like signal noise ratio. I think there's a lot of noise. And again, it's kind of like, who are these people? I think there are actually a lot of ways that you can vet vendors through stuff that's on the internet. So I actually think Glassdoor is a great way to vet vendors.
Really?
Glassdoor obviously like has its problems with, people who get let go or people who have access to grind or whatever. And also on the flip side, I think the Wall Street Journal just wrote this thing up that maybe it was Tesla was like manipulating their reviews in a positive way. And I think honestly, like a lot of sophisticated companies are doing the same thing, because why wouldn't you? It's just like on the vendor review websites like Capterra, G2 Crowd. Like, guess what? There's a reason why every company on there is a 4.5-star rating. It's because the VP of marketing at Capterra, at XYZ vendor, is really, really good at making sure their best customers go on there and leave reviews. But that's
G2 Crowd?
Yeah, G2 Crowd. Yeah, I think it's g2.com maybe.
Okay.
So anyways, like I think Glassdoor is actually good because as an HR professional, you're just used to reading Glassdoor reviews. And so you know how to interpret them, and you understand that like if you see 3 really positive ones in the span of a week, that means that somebody from HR or the executive level was like, hey, leave some good reviews. And if you see like 4 or 5 bad ones in a week, that means there was layoffs. And so you can like sort of like parse through and understand like what's actually going on in a company, I think, through reading Glassdoor. I think if you've got a LinkedIn premium seat, you can go on the LinkedIn company page and understand their company headcount. Is it growing? You can look at their career website and be like, oh, okay, are they hiring? Are they hiring for the right roles? Like sales, engineering, stuff like that, implying that the company is really growing. Are they raising venture capital money? That can be a good thing or a bad thing. I think if you're raising from top tier firms recently, that's always a good thing. If you publish the valuation, that's always a good thing. So there's all these sort of like online signals. You can go to similarweb.com and look at the traffic of a website and understand if it's growing or not. And so there's all these like signals to see if there's growth there. In addition to look at the, VP of marketing, engineering, et cetera, look at their backgrounds. Like, did they do impressive stuff in the past? If so, they're working at that company for a reason. Like, they have lots of options and they chose to work at this company. So I think those are all really good signals, and vice versa. The problem is that there are also a lot of really great vendors out there that maybe aren't growing. Maybe they've like hit steady state. Maybe they're not doing the venture back thing, but they're still awesome products. So this isn't like the be all end all, but there are signals, and they're worth looking at when you are understanding whether or not to partner with a vendor.
Yeah. When you talk about new HR tech startups, you kind of mentioned if they have funding, if they're hiring, it's kind of a good sign. What are some of the bad signs to look out for? I think you mentioned a few of those too, with layoffs. But like if you're a new vendor, like one thing I always look for is like, okay, if their blog is like 2 years out of date, that's a bad sign, right? They're not. What's going on there where they kind of stopped marketing themselves or things like that? But you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that is definitely a signal. I think like probably the opposite of everything I said are signals. And then like at the end of the day, it's all about, do you think they're going to be a valuable addition to your tech stack? And if you think that and you have conviction around it, chances are other people think that too, and they're getting value, and therefore they're growing. Another thing you can do, there's this website called Datanyze that tracks like how many companies use XYZ technology. And so you can, I think for free, you can see like this month, how many people are using Lever. And then the next month you can look at how many people are using Lever, and they'll show you how many additions they had and how many subtractions. And you can kind of like do some math and figure out like, oh, okay, like 20%, I'm making this up, for Lever. It could be, negative for all I know, negative churn, but 20% of their customers leave every year. And when I compare that to, Greenhouse, Workable, Google Hire, whatever, they're all at 5%. Okay, so I shouldn't use that first technology. And I'm not saying anything about Lever. I'm just like pulling names out of a hat. But that's like another thing. You can kind of do your own like churn analysis and understand that. It's actually something we're trying to do with Select Software. Like, I think that people vote with their wallets. And so if people are buying and staying on technology, that's a really strong signal for me. And so we're actually asking vendors, like, what are your churn rates? And if you're a top quartile SaaS company, which means that you have 85+% retention, that's like a really strong signal of whether or not we'll actually feature you on our website.
Gotcha. Talk about the ROI of all this. What do you have to do as a TA person or an HR leader inside an organization to come up with the ROI of a product and kind of being able to sell that to you, or your CFO or whoever pays the checks there?
Yeah. So I think, we kind of talked about this for a second earlier. Like, you probably are going after a new piece of technology, not because you're bored or you want more work, but because there's a problem. Maybe it's a problem where you're replacing something, you've got some really terrible ATS, you're going to replace it. Maybe it's a problem where it's like, all right, we need more diversity candidates, we need more engineering candidates, like whatever the case may be, like we've got to figure out a way to do that. And so I think the really hard part is, like, how do you take that pain and then translate it into a business case? And for some things, it's very obvious. Like, if you're gonna, buy something that like gets you more salespeople, getting more salespeople has a very obvious impact on the business. Like, each new salesperson brings in $1 million a year, and our company is valued at 10 times revenue, and therefore, each new salesperson is worth $10 million or something like that, right? But for something like maybe, increasing retention or whatever the case may be, it's not quite as obvious. But as a general framework, what I would recommend is thinking deeply about like the pain that you're trying to address, writing it down and figuring out, okay, like, how does this impact the business? And for some things, it could be like an income statement impact, like we just talked about with the sales organization. For some things where it's actually like changing the income statement of the business, right? Increasing revenues for the business as a whole. For some things, it could be things that impact your budget. For example, maybe you're going to buy some sort of sourcing tool. You're going to buy HireTool or LinkedIn Recruiter or whatever, because you're spending a ton of money on agency fees. And so the return on investment, it's not like I guess the pain point is like, man, we don't like dealing with agencies. They cost so much money, blah, blah, blah. And then translating that into the ROI is like, well, if we spend, $30K on these seats for these technologies, we think we can decrease the agency fee from $300K to $100K. Therefore, we're saving $200,000 minus $30,000, $170K a year. Isn't that pretty sweet? And then I think the really interesting thing is you go back 6 months after buying LinkedIn Recruiter or whatever it is, and you say, okay, so here's what we thought would happen. We thought we'd buy 3 seats of this thing, and we thought that it would lead to 10 hires, which would decrease our agency spend by $200,000, $20,000 a head. And what actually happened is we bought these 3 seats, and one of our recruiters quit the next day, and so we only used 2 of them, and we only hired 6 people. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's like, well, we bought these 3 seats, and turns out like people just love the product, and we actually ended up hiring like the entire new engineering team through this thing, and we totally wiped out our agency spend. Blah blah blah. Aren't we heroes? And then the cool thing is, like, no matter what happens in the future, when you do this sort of business case, this ROI analysis, you are building a tremendous amount of credibility in the organization, because you're thinking more like a business leader, people ops person or whatever, more like the chief people officer versus the maybe like HR coordinator. And so you're gaining credibility that way. And then you're also learning. You're learning about what assumptions are correct or incorrect, and you're using data to figure out whether or not you were right, which I think will help you a lot when you do that next business case, when you pitch that next product or project to the CFO, and you're like, hey, we need XYZ amount of dollars to do this thing. And they're like, all right, well, let's look at like the past things you've done and how you've thought about them. Oh, this is like super analytical and rigorous. I love it. Even though, this one didn't work out, these two did. And therefore, yeah, sure, I'll give you the money for this new thing that you want. Yeah.
Let me take a quick break here just to welcome some of the people watching. I see Maury on the call. Hey, Maury. Brian Douglas, Jacob, Lauren, Phil, and Phil, you're there, and Patrick Campbell. Hey, how's it going, guys? Glad you could join us. If you guys have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat there for Phil. Phil, talk about the internal stakeholders again, if you could, in terms of, one thing I always tell HR department, they're not, tech savvy people by nature, right? So one thing I always tell them is to, bring somebody from like an IT in, right, or like an IT project manager maybe.
Yeah.
Kind of the language, right, of technology, and have them sit in on the calls, with the vendors themselves, have them sit on the demos. I think they can help you. They're a good resource internally that you may not have in your department to help you kind of understand some of the technology overall, what it can and cannot do, right? What other tips around that might you have to help them?
Yeah, so yeah, I completely agree on that. One of the more interesting tactics that I learned over the past 6 months came from this woman, Stacey Justice at Brightcove. She's like director of people ops over there. They were buying a new piece of technology, and what she did was she basically put it out on Slack, like, "Hey, we're gonna buy something that helps like increase our culture quotient, right? Like culture, it's not an issue here, but like we want to just like make sure it's stronger. Anybody interested in that?" And lo and behold, like there's people that are interested in this stuff, right? Like even people in marketing or engineering, like they're interested in recruiting, they're interested in culture. And so a bunch of people raised their hand, and all of a sudden she had this like cross-functional committee that one is more powerful at the initial brainstorming because you have a diversity of thought. You've got different skill sets and backgrounds trying to figure out how do we tackle this one problem. And you're just going to have better ideas, right? As long as you have a leader that can drive consensus eventually, and things don't get out of hand, you don't get this list of 900 ideas that you can't execute any of them because you're too busy. But in more cases than not, you're going to have better ideas, and then you're going to be able to have a better debate and then focus in on what you actually want to do. And in this case, they bought a performance management system called Reflective. And so that's like one part of it, right? Is like getting these like internal stakeholders to help you build the idea. By definition, you now have buy-in like across functions. So you've got somebody from marketing, sales, engineering, et cetera, who are like, yeah, this is a good idea. And they're probably someone who's senior or rising, because those are the types of people that raise their hands for this sort of stuff. If you're like the person who's not good at their job and like, keeps their head down all day, like you're not raising your hand to go do extra work. So you have like credible people who are bought into this thing. That means that when you go to get the budget, it's so much easier, because in large part, like these people are driving the business. For marketing to add like 10K to their budget, probably not the biggest deal in the world, whereas for HR to add 10,000 or 100,000, depending on how large your organization is, that can be a lot of money, and that can be like a very long process. And so getting these people on board, boom, your budget's there. And then the last part of it that's really maybe the most interesting is on implementation. And this is particularly true for solutions that roll out across the organization. That could be something like an ATS, could be something like employee recognition rewards program, whatever the case may be. In this case, performance management. Without a doubt, every function, every employee is going to touch this thing, and they need to be bought in. Otherwise, people aren't going to create a profile, use it on a weekly basis, understand what the heck this thing is that people are asking me to use. But if the functional leader in your division is like, hey, here's the thing we're doing, here's why we're doing it, blah, 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 they translate into the language that you understand, whether you're an engineer, marketer, or whatever, you're more likely to do it. And therefore the implementation, the rollout, all that good stuff is going to be a lot more successful. So to me, that's like just such a home run. Like unless it's a small tool, I don't understand why you wouldn't do one of these cross-functional buying committees to do new projects.
Definitely. No, it's good. It's a great story, and definitely a good tip. When it comes to things like integration overall, what are some questions that you should be asking? I know you've got a post there on your site, 300 questions to ask ATS. Great list, by the way.
Nice.
Give me 8 to 10 here that kind of come top of mind as far as most important.
Yeah, I think it really depends on you. My advice is make a spreadsheet, put your must-haves, like your 5 to 10 must-haves in the first 10 rows of that spreadsheet, put the next batch of stuff, maybe it's 20 or 30 things in the next batch, in the next rows. And for you, it might be, sourcing, integration with HRIS, integration with like 3 tools you really use: CRM, career website, talent community, social recruiting. Like these are all sort of like the new fangled, like sexier AI type stuff that you're probably looking for in a new ATS. If you're looking for a new ATS, otherwise you're just satisfied with sort of the status quo. But definitely, like, I just wrote this blog post, I haven't published it yet, but like, if you think back to the last major purchasing decision you made, it's really hard to keep things straight in your head. Like I look back on like some of the apartments that I bought or whatever, and like, you go see like 5 places in a day and you come home and you're like, was the balcony on the first one or the second one? Like when you're in there, you're like, I'm never going to forget this fireplace. And then you go home and you're like, oh my God, like I can't keep track of any of this stuff.
That totally happens so much if you're doing multiple demos like in a week. Forget
exactly.
it. Mind it to each other.
Yeah, it's even harder with HR tech because like the solutions are fairly similar. You're probably doing them over the course of a couple of weeks. It's just impossible to keep this stuff straight. So create a spreadsheet. Each row is a feature that you care about. Each column is a vendor. Put down yes or no if they've got something, or is it in the pipeline, their product pipeline, and then some notes like, yeah, they've got sourcing, but XYZ, or yeah, they've got CRM, but it costs double the price or whatever. The other thing that I would put in the spreadsheet that I think is super important, a lot of people don't think too much about, is the quality of your sales rep. And again, this goes back to like, how do you vet companies? If your sales is phenomenal, they've got a million opportunities to make a ton of money. As we all know, quota-bearing sales reps that are hitting quota, they want to be at a company that has the best product because that allows them to make the most amount of money, and they're choosing to be at this company. They're also potentially going to represent you. You do a second demo with your buying committee or your CFO or whatever. You want to be represented well. And vice versa is true of this as well. You've got a rep you don't trust that's pushing you too much, that seems like they're cranky, whatever. You might get them on a bad day, but it might mean that they're not hitting quota because this is not a good solution, and therefore you should stay away. So that's another sort of thing that I would look for when vetting software.
Yeah. Here's a question for you. A lot of these HR tech companies say they integrate with, some of the back-end systems, ATSs, things like Workday. If they don't integrate with one of those companies that you have in-house initially, how big of a flag is that for you as a buyer of that software? Tell me a little bit around what you should be thinking about, if that particular product has not integrated with something you have in-house already.
Yeah, I think you have to think deeply about why you're asking that question. I know when I was getting Next Wave Hire off the ground and doing a lot of the sales, and people would always ask like, oh, do you integrate with like XYZ? And like, sometimes it would have no relevance to what we're doing. And like, they're just asking this question, like to ask it almost, or it's like, oh, do you integrate with our HRIS? Nope, because there's no reason for us to integrate with your HRIS. Like, yeah. Or people would ask like, do you integrate with our ATS? And it's like, well, what do you mean by integrate? Like, what do you want? Don't ask integrate to like check the box on it. Like ask like, do you do specific thing 1, 2, 3? Like, do you pass candidate data from one system to the next? What kind of candidate data? How does that candidate data get passed? Et cetera, et cetera. Like go 1 or 2 levels down. Because like integrate with your ATS, it's like, yeah, sure, we integrate with your ATS. Like what is your definition of integrate? Like we can power a career website with the jobs. Sure, of course. And for us, especially as like an early stage company, like you always are super transparent, because if you're not, you're going to get this customer that's going to say negative things, and that's like a huge cost to your business, and you're going to spend so much time on them that it becomes a negative gross margin product, or customer rather. They pay you $10 and you end up spending 50 hours with them. It's just not worth it. But for a lot of sales reps, like, they don't have that incentive, right? Like, their incentive is to book business. That's when they get their bonus. And maybe 6 months from now, they're going to be a different company anyways. And so really dig down deep with these questions and figure out, what are you really asking with this like integration thing? And then ask the specific question around what you care about.
What should the vendor be asking the employer? Turn around.
That's a good question. I think that, there's obviously, like, the initial conversation is always about this sort of like BANT qualification, like budget, authority, need, timeline. Hey, HR practitioner, like, are you kicking tires? Are you bored? Are you wasting my time? Or do you have the budget? Do you have the authority? Who else needs to be part of this thing? Do you have the need? Like, if you don't have the need, you're probably not actually going to execute this thing at the end of the day. You're going to realize this isn't a good use of your time and money.
Right.
And then what's your timeline? Are you serious about this? Is this like, are you on this like ridiculous 18-month like budget cycle, and this is going to happen in 2021? Or should I actually spend time on it now? So I think those are always the things that salespeople should be thinking about and are thinking about. And salespeople are really good at understanding that their most valuable commodity is their time. They don't want to waste it on the wrong prospects. But yeah, and I think beyond that, it's just more about like the details around how do things work at that organization, how can they be helpful to getting the HR practitioner, the recruiter, to accomplish their own goals.
Nice. Pricing, how do you negotiate that? Give us some tips there.
Yeah, so I think any company that doesn't list pricing on the website, pricing is probably open to negotiation to some extent. You can obviously get what's that?
Or it's really expensive.
Yeah, or it's really expensive, right? It's shocking to put $1 million a year on a website, even though if you're a huge company like Taleo, is going to cost you $1 million a year. So I think that multi-year deals, if you're willing to lock yourself in and think about it, like ATS, like you're probably going to use that for a couple years anyways. Like, why not get a discount, get that 20% discount by signing a 2 or 3 year deal, paying up front. Obviously you're going to get a deal. You're essentially giving a loan to the company. And for startups, their cost of capital, this is like a little bit financy, but like, think about if a startup was going to get a loan. First of all, no one would give a startup a loan. If they did, the interest rate would be like 50%, right? Like the venture dollars, the venture capitalists are looking for 100% annual return. Otherwise that CEO and VP of sales gets fired. And therefore their cost of capital is 100%. So if you can give them a loan, they're going to give you 25%, no doubt about it. So paying up front for the year is huge. And you can probably even get a higher than 20% discount if you want to like lay out that math to the VP of sales or whatever. They might be like, hey, why not? I think like having some sort of brand value that you can bring to the company, whether that's a logo or yourself personally. If you're somebody who's out there on like the speaker circuit, you've got a blog, you've got a Twitter following, LinkedIn following, whatever, all of a sudden, like you can bring them value and they're going to compensate you for that value by, you giving a case study or you talking about them at a panel or whatever the case may be. So those are some of the big buckets. And I think the last one would be around implementation fees. So most of these software businesses, how are they valued? It's on recurring revenue, multiple of recurring revenue. And therefore, that's what they care about. That's what the board and shareholders care about. And that trickles down to the VP of sales, the account reps, how everybody's incentivized, et cetera. And so I think that many times you can ditch the implementation fees because they're not making any money off them anyways. And they're not increasing the value of their business through those.
Those are more negotiable, basically.
They're more negotiable, yeah.
Yeah, I would add to that, tell the vendor that you're actively shopping, right? And tell them what other vendors you're looking at. Maybe even ask it.
Yeah.
But you want to definitely play them against each other if you can, if you have that in your back pocket. Just a quick story. At my last recruiting gig, We had Taleo in place. It was horrible. It was a horrible installation. So we went out shopping for a new one. So I brought in probably 5 or 6 vendors to do demos. Got down to Job Biden iSIMS, and just basically, they were both calling me, right? Both the sales guys were calling me, trying to figure out who's going to win, basically. And they definitely, I kind of dragged out a little bit, and they brought the pricing down a little bit as well. So I kind of waited them out a bit, and lo and behold, they lowered the price on a few things. So it's another way to look at it too. Play with the vendors against each other, tell them you're actively looking and shopping, and you should get a better deal, I think.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Nice. Awesome, Phil. Well, this has been a great talk. I appreciate your time today. Looking at the last question, what kind of technology should HR be looking at today? What's on your radar? You got things like chatbots out there, automation tools, but what's on your radar these days?
Yeah, I think there's a couple cool things. I guess there's a lot, and that's what we try to cover on Select Software, and it's always changing. But 2 of the categories that have kind of struck me recently, one are tech assessment platforms, where basically right now, if you're hiring a bunch of engineers, you probably have your engineering team like doing pair programming, vetting their technical capabilities, as opposed to wasting your engineering resources on interviewing. You can send your candidates a test, and basically they do the test, they get assessed in a programmatic way that decreases unconscious bias and stuff like that. It also expands your funnel because you're not just looking at people with a CS degree from Stanford. You're looking at just the people that have the skills, which is what matters at the end of the day. And so there's a lot to really like about it. And I think it's really cool you can get started with if you're hiring 1 engineer or you're hiring 1,000 engineers. So pretty neat. A couple of the vendors in that space are like CodeSignal, Qualified, Codility. There's a bunch.
I just saw one I wrote about on Creating Headlines, which was it's got $650K in seed funding. It's called Nexa. I think it's NEXZA, and it's for tech skill assessments. Forget the resume, put you through a test or whatever. But yeah, I think that's interesting too. It's it's a better way to apply, essentially. I mean,
much better.
The resume is, it's not that good when it comes to that kind of stuff. You need to know what they know and how they're going to do it, and that's what these new tools are providing. So it's definitely an interesting class to me as well. Yeah, without a doubt. And then you're saving your engineers time, which is great. The other one is these automated sourcing platforms. So vSource, Fetcher, Top Funnel. Basically give them a rep and they'll go just start sending you candidates. And that's pretty nice, right? If you don't have dedicated sourcing, you're full desk recruiter. Even if you do have dedicated sourcing, and it's another solution that is relevant for super small companies all the way up through enterprise. So definitely another cool space that I'm taking a look at through Select Software. What were those names again?
Fetcher, vSource, Top Funnel.
Fetcher, vSource, and Top Funnel. Okay. I know Great People, the ATS just came out with something called Eureka, which does something like that. I don't know how it works or exactly what it does, but it's some kind of automated sourcing tool. And I believe Intel has something around that as well overall. But I do think that just this bubbling up of candidates automatically is something that, the data is out there. It's just a matter of putting that algorithm to work and surfacing those candidates for them.
Yeah.
Nice. Awesome. Well, Phil from SelectSoftwareReviews.com, appreciate the time today. And
of course.
Thanks for coming on. So that's it today, guys. Appreciate you coming on. Again, the replay will be available very shortly. I'll push it out to YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and we'll see you next month. Thanks for watching. Take care, Phil.
See ya. Thanks.